strenuously exploratory as a thinker, and at the same time, deeply human. Her ability to be what often seems to be oppositional. It's not that alone. It is the clarity and the incisiveness that she brings to her articulation of every view that I've heard. In every conversation that I've had with Lata, there has been clarity, there has been illumination, and most importantly, there is her presence, which is one of luminous integrity. I'm delighted to be here in conversation with Lata Mani. And that's when a round of applause is called for. Thank you. Lata is many things, as her introduction suggested, but I'm going to kickstart by just asking her, Lata, about the title for this particular session that you've arrived at, To Love is to Know. And it's a title that resonated with me deeply, because as I said to you earlier, it's also something that I talk about at some length in the introduction to my anthology, Eating God. The idea that the seeker, the Jnana Margi, and the Bhakti Margi are not necessarily two different people, that they are not mutually exclusive. This idea excites me, and I particularly liked the succinctness of your title. So I'd ask you to say more about that.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to the festival and for inviting me to converse with you. And I want to thank everyone who has preceded me for an extraordinary day, really. And the level of the discussion, the level of the expression has really set the tone for a conversation like this, because it illuminates something very beautiful about what one might call Indic tradition, Bhakti tradition.
I'm sorry, can you hear Lata? Just a little closer.
Should I hold it up? Hold it up closer. Okay. Something very beautiful about the Indic tradition has been made manifest today, which is its extraordinary force, plurality, beauty, and persistence. Its persistence across a range of domains, its expression in a variety of registers, and its capacity to exist both inside of time and outside of time. And I think the yantra is a beautiful geometric representation for what we've experienced today, which is the yantra is offered to the spiritual aspirant as a kind of geometric mapping of the cosmos that allows each individual, according to their nature, to enter from the portal that is closest to their nature, and then undertake a journey in which is unfolded something about their own relationship to the phenomenal world and to creation. And bhakti, if one thinks about the way it's been talked about so far in our discussions, it has been talked about as a movement that is locatable in history. It has been talked about as a form of conversation, engagement, intimacy with the divine. But prior to all of this, I would say that bhakti is the very cause of creation. In other words, the world or creation exists because of the love of the divine. It is an expression of the love of the divine. So if we think about it that way, bhakti is the first cause. And our capacity to love each other and our capacity to love God are simultaneously bequeathed to us in the manifestation of creation as an act of the love of the divine. So in that sense, bhakti is a kind of pedagogy that is implicit in creation itself, which is why it has the kind of staying power and philosophical depth and the multiplicity of expressions that we have experienced today in the kinds of poetry. And I think that some of the tensions that have been named and discussed today have more to do with our modern tendency to binarize. Because it is we who have produced the binary of the sacred and the profane, or the sacred and the banal. Clearly doesn't exist, as is evident in all the poems that were read by people. There is a fundamental tension, I think, that is there within the tradition between what one might broadly call the tantric and the atantric or anti-tantric impulse, if you like, or tendency. And by that, all I mean is those aspects of the tradition that unequivocally embrace materiality, embodiment, matter, sensation, touch, tactility, phenomenality, the fact of existence, right? And those traditions that shy away from an unequivocal embrace of matter in favor of some notion of the transcendent, in favor of the search for meaning outside of the cut and thrust of matter itself, or that which constitutes the world itself. So to some degree, some of the binaries that everyone is seeking to trouble in the course of their discussions of bhakti come out of that tendency within the tradition, mapped onto which is what I would say a kind of post-colonial, post-enlightenment binarization, which tends to read the tradition in a certain way and therefore finds contradictions or tensions which are actually not present quite in that way in the tradition itself. I don't know if that makes sense.
Do you think it's that kind of binarizing, if you will, that is responsible for this idea that the life of the mind and the life of the heart, or the language of the mind and the language of the heart, are two different languages, which is a premise that is quite pervasive?
Absolutely, absolutely. If you think about, I mean, why did I say to love is to know? It's the portal. The path, there are these four paths, bhakti, tantra, jnana, karma. One can understand it this way. If bhakti is the first cause, that in other words, the first cause of creation itself, tantra is its first effect. Because in the creation of the universe is the creation of matter. In the creation of the universe, in love, out of love, because of love of matter, matter itself arrives as inherently, intrinsically beautiful, right? Then jnana is how you understand matter, phenomenality, your relationship to the divine, and karma is how you tend creation. Creation understood as a manifestation of love itself. And the capacity to love is, of course, bequeathed to humans. To love each other, to love matter, to love God or not. And the or not is very important because we are given free will. And because we are given free will, inquiry is central to the tradition itself. We often think of the idea of criticality as being a modern sensibility, as a modern disposition, right? But not at all. Once you have a manifestation of an order to which humans are invited with the capacity for free will to say yes or no, inquiry is then built into the pedagogy of creation itself. So this idea that somehow that there is the jnana path, and it's somehow superior or to the bhakti path, and that bhakti path is only about sensation and feeling and emotion, and that it is not a cognitive path, is really problematic. And you could say that it's a misperception. Yeah? And an original misperception like that gives rise to tertiary misperceptions. And some of the ways in which we have tended to talk about these traditions reflect those tertiary misperceptions, which are then compounded by a certain kind of post-enlightenment way of thinking.
I must, and I've sounded Lata out on this very briefly, so I will allow myself what might seem like a foray but isn't. I think when one hears Lata, the question that invariably comes up is, who is she? Where is this particular kind of articulation coming from? Is this her training? Is this something that she schooled herself in? What lies behind this articulation and this insight? So I'm going to ask Lata to talk a little more about it, to the extent that she's comfortable. But very briefly, I found this beautiful line in an interview with her, where she says that one day in the year 1993, her very head-oriented approach to life, she had been an academic, a very successful academic. She says her head-oriented approach to life literally and figuratively turned turtle when she met with a head-on collision in Southern California with a truck, was it? And she says after that she had to actually plot her whole life, recraft it, reperceive it, ground upward. For me, that particular image was vivid and quieting. And I'd ask you to say something more about how 1993 and life post-1993 has shaped your understanding of bhakti, but shaped your understanding of life, perhaps.
Sure. I think some of us are hard nuts to crack, and I think I was a particularly hard nut to crack. And so something as dramatic as a brain injury was required before I would reconsider my perceptual frameworks. I was quite satisfied with the Marxist feminism that had shaped my own my own intellectual formation. And in the course, I was hit at 100 miles an hour by a Coca-Cola truck carrying bottles, not even cans. And it's quite remarkable that I survived this collision, but my brain did not survive the collision was not intact, let's put it that way. And I entered a very long period where mind was very quiet, brain was very inactive, but I began to experience states of consciousness for which I had no language. I began to experience a kind of love that I had never experienced before, and hearing in my inner ear words and poems and songs and invitations that I'd never heard before. And I had no choice but to open myself and to allow this force to teach me. And that was the moment of my apprenticeship. That is when my apprenticeship began, and it continued. What I was experiencing during the depths of the brain injury was something for which neither Marxism, nor post-colonial theory, nor feminism had prepared me. And yet, and this is what often happens to the seeker at the very beginning, you are very naive, or let me use a less judgmental term, one is very innocent. One feels that one's entire life has changed. One can never be the same again, and that nothing that one had ever had access to prior to this experience could possibly be of any value, And one of the things about the spiritual journey, as anyone who's been on one would recognize, is that every idea you have about the spiritual journey is turned turtle, to borrow a term from you. And what became clear to me midway through my recovery was that really the invitation was not just to open to this nameless, formless, immeasurable love and how it was remaking my consciousness, but how to integrate it with my prior training. How to find language for it, what is the nature of the bridge? Is there a bridge? What does Marxism or feminism have to do with the spiritual journey? What is it that a new experience can help illuminate in terms of the kinds of issues that I was interested in previously? So that then led to 2 books. One was called Sacred Secular, Contemplative Cultural Critique, where I looked, because it was in the time of my injury, 1993, we had Babri Masjid, and India, the 2 things happened to India, basically Hindutva and neoliberal globalization. So I thought, what better domains to examine through the lens of the contemplative than these 2? And subsequent to that, I found there is a great deal of resistance to the idea of the sacred. There simply is. Sacred is acceptable as a form of experience. The sacred is acceptable as a source of philosophy. The sacred is acceptable as poetry and as music, but not as a cognitive resource. There's still a great deal of resistance to that. So for my next book, which is called The Integral Nature of Things, I thought, let me take an idea that's integral to sacred philosophies, not call it the sacred, right? So the idea of interdependence, that everything is mutually constituted in relation to everything else, which is a very fundamental idea within Buddhism and in Hinduism. In Buddhism, it's called dependent co-arising. And examine how it is that our knowledge frameworks disarticulate that which is intrinsically interconnected, and what might it look like to try to rearticulate those connections. So that was the project there. So yes, 1993 remade me. It is still remaking me, and I'm still trying to find language adequate to the experience of material life and a spiritual life.
You know, what interested me as you spoke was this quest for language is something I understand as a practitioner and as a lover and a reader of poetry, because poetry compels you in some way to constantly confront uncertainty, to try to wrest something fresh from the familiar. That is our business in a way as poets. So even when I've been through periods in my life, certainly one, where I felt absolutely inarticulate and speechless and thought I would never come out of it. So going back to what you were saying about how one believes that it is pretty much the end of life as you knew it and the beginning of a new one. Although I believed that of myself, I found poetry found its way back into my life, perhaps differently, but it found its way back. And now I see why. It was an organic way in which it found its way back into my life, because poetry, by definition, is about trying to create form in a situation of freedom. And it's a terrifying thing, it's a lonely thing, it's often completely unproductive. You don't get there, you're searching for a poem that eludes you, but it's part of the process. In your case, where your training was, as you point out, in this Marxist feminist framework, Lata is the author of a very significant post-colonial feminist work on sati. So it often seems to me, when I look at Lata Mani, it seems to me almost like 2 incarnations. And I'm curious to know, although you see the connections between the earlier and this one, I'm curious to know how those connections have endured and what kind of conversations go on between the Lata Mani who authored that text and many others, and the Lata Mani who is the contemplative writer who authors Interleaves, the Tantra Chronicles, of course that being a somewhat different work, but who was receptor enough to author that, or to receive that, let's say, or receive those teachings, and who now seeks to turn Bhakti into this cognitive mode, to be talking about Bhakti and cognition in the way that you are. Who is this Lata Mani, and how does this conversation happen between the earlier one and this?
Goodness me, I don't know if I can answer that. There's so many questions embedded in that. Let me go at it tangentially. What most spiritual traditions do is they address the individual. Spiritual teachings, they obviously they have valence and resonance for more than the individual, right? But fundamentally, spiritual teachings address the individual. What I would say secular forms of knowledge offer us is a notion of the social. Spiritual teachings can give you an idea of, they are unitive philosophies. When they are practiced at their deepest level, what you experience is your intimacy with the whole of the universe. So it's an individual journey, but it's not an individualist journey. You increasingly find yourself recast as multiply constituted within infinite relations that you cannot possibly understand and grasp. And as you understand yourself as a dancing molecule, you are both opened to leaning into, bowing down with, the rest of creation, that gesture of surrender, that is very much at the heart of the yearning of love for which we name as Bhakti, right? So you do have a sense of your connection to something larger, but there is an intermediate category called the social, and that is what sociology, history, politics, philosophy, all of these secular forms of knowledge give you. And if you are to strive for unconditioned knowledge, you have to understand your own social formation. If you are not to reproduce the cultural conditioning of the tradition into which you are born, or the tradition that calls to you, we may be born into a tradition called Hinduism, and we may be called by Sufism or Buddhism, or whatever it is. If we are to strive for unconditioned knowledge, there is no way to do that without understanding how is hate culturally legitimized, for example. How is greed made socially acceptable so that the profit motive and aspiration is so naturalized that we do not take a critical view of the kind of economic system within which we live. Right? All of this cannot come to you only from the spiritual teachings. Right? You draw on these other knowledges. And one is not unique in doing that. After all, a weaver draws on metaphors from weaving. A weaver may draw on metaphors from farming, so one draws on whatever lexicon is available. And I guess since this was my lexicon, my intellectual lexicon, this is the kind of transcoding I'm finding myself engaged in. That's a partial answer to your question.
It's a persuasive answer. I mean, I'll take it for now, but I would love it. I think it's going to come up again in the conversation that we will open up to very shortly. But I also want to ask you, Lata, you've talked about Bhakti as pedagogy for living. That's what you talk about. And to link this with the earlier conversation that Sachi moderated on Bhakti in an ethos of disbelief, in many ways it just feels that I think we'd all be agreed on this one at least, that we live in this horrifically polarized world in which sometimes the choices seem absolutely dire between a kind of very barren, very sterile secularism and kind of terrifyingly infantile religiosity, intolerant, bigoted religiosity on the other. So sometimes between these two terrifying alternatives, it feels like life is hard. And what is the role that bhakti can play? And what is its relevance in a world like this for you? How do you see it?
Bhakti is very simply acknowledgement of the fact of intimacy. That's what it is. And once you acknowledge intimacy, bhakti becomes a disposition, right? How is it that I experience my intimacy? I experience it by opening myself to that which I don't know, that which I love, that which I will allow to remake me, and that which I would love to share with the other. If there is something that I think marks most authoritarian or sectarian or hate-filled discourse, it's the violent act of othering. To other is to deny intimacy. So the very premise is something that is precluded by it's very sad that the word bhakt has now become associated with the right. And this idea somehow that that a true bhakti is an unreflective being is deeply problematic. After all, you take any saint or any poet, bhakti poet, and you look at their oeuvre across time, you can see they are very clear about how their own perceptions are changing and shifting. And indeed, part of what they are sharing in their poetic expression is precisely their transforming consciousness. Right? So I think that the problem of this binary between hate on the one side, dry secularism on the other side, is actually ignoring the vast middle ground. And the vast middle ground is much more complex and rich and fecund than that. And I think we saw that even so far today.
Absolutely. Yes.
So I think we really must, we must distrust binaries as an a priori. That divisive, the energy of binary thinking is deeply problematic, and I think that we would do well to look at how our way of thinking is the predominant ways of thinking orient us to not noticing that which predominates. Does that make sense? Because Kabir and all the mystic poets are known by people who've had no education. They are our homegrown philosophers. They do not need to go to university to understand this. In fact, most of us who have gone to university, myself included, I am a prime example of a post-colonial subject who fundamentally thinks in English and can only express herself in English. So I am, in that sense, from that perspective, a classic example of the alienated individual. However, this is a very capacious civilization. It allows one to enter it energetically. And I would say that my entry is not through language, which would be a very, very rich point of entry. It's denied to me. My entry is through energy. My entry is through ethos. And my entry is through opening to a notion of time that is much broader than historical time. And I think a problem with modernity is this over-identification with history. I'm not saying history is not important. I was trained as a historian. History is very important. But we also have other notions of time that we would do well to just open to as a dimension of consciousness.
In addition to her work as writer, Lata has also worked with a filmmaker, and they've both worked together on transmedia projects of different kinds. There have been audio and video installations. And I haven't seen all of it, but I've seen some of it, enough to know that I'm curious about what led you in those directions. Was it what you're talking about now, the fact that your entry point into this is not language, and therefore there were ways, you were searching in a way for other modes of self-expression?
Well, language continues to be important, but it's now visual language and sonic language, and it's like that. I think what became clear to me was that we need to pluralize the forms of expression. But we live in a visually saturated universe. So for me, okay, there were two projects coming together. I worked with an Argentinian filmmaker called Nicolás Grandi. We started working together purely by accident. I was asking myself the question as to whether whether the word could be remade. In other words, could we, in a highly instrumental world, where instrumentalist logic dominates, is it possible to re-enchant the word, was my question. His question was, is it possible to re-enchant the image in an image-saturated world? So we started working together. I love the discipline of giving up the word, in a way, because when you work across other media, then the word becomes just a humble element. And he was interested in what it would mean to incorporate word or text in visuality. So that's how our conversations began, and they have expanded and extended. And now I feel like the question of form is very important. I think that even more than the what, I think the how. And in some ways, I think that Bhakti poetry, in its impulse from the very beginning, has always married, for want of a better word, the question of the what and the how. Perhaps poetry more generally.
Almost by definition.
Yeah, by definition. So.
We're going to pause now and open this up. If there's anyone in the audience who has questions, I see Danish's hand go up. Could we have a mic there, please? If there are responses, questions, Danish and Indira.
Hey, hi Lata. Thank you for this conversation, both of you. My question, it could be slightly out of place also, and also could reflect my lack of understanding. But to one point that you raised, as sacred is not used enough as a cognitive resource. Sacred is not used as a cognitive resource. Yeah. And then I would like to nudge you to something which you said later in the conversation, where you said Bhakti is an act of intimacy. Bhakti is an act of intimacy.
Is an act
of intimacy.
Intimacy.
So, is it in some sense Freudian that the intimacy scares people to use sacred as the cognitive resource? I mean, I'm just thinking aloud.
That's a very interesting question. I think it bears deeper reflection than I would be able to bring to bear on it in this moment. But I do think that there is, I think that it's a paradox. Human loneliness comes from the sense of separation. So much of what we do is to reach out across the divide of this perceived separation. And yet, there is also a terror of intimacy, because there's often a sense that to soften the boundary is to open to chaos. So there is that fear. And I think that quite often people can shuttle between those two, between the kind of the longing for connection and the fear of connection. And it is when you liberate that dynamic from being only in relation to humans. In other words, you take that dynamic, that fear and that desire and that longing and that worry, and you reorient it triadically. You, the divine, other humans, or you, the divine, the rest of the phenomenal world, that animate, inanimate, animals, nature, everything. I think you are enabled to experience an expansiveness that, while it unmoors you, also liberates you to experiencing something which then perhaps you would risk with other humans. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Hello. Lata, thank you, Arundhathi, thank you so much for this illuminating conversation. So many questions and so, this journey that you've gone through, I was just intensely interested in everything about it. I have a small question pursuing the last part of your discussion, or the sort of middle to last part, which was Arundhathi's question about the social. And then you talked about, how your earlier training connected. I was also thinking about when you began by talking about how Bhakti, then your conception of Bhakti and Tantra relate to contemporary affairs and what's happening to our pluralism, things like Babri Masjid and Hindutva. So my question is about the social. It's on the one hand, yes, the people who practice bhakti in many different forms, who are not English oriented or who are not educated in a Western way, they certainly carry on their lives with bhakti, but aren't they also part of a discourse of othering, which figures in all these new developments? Is it simply, would you say that that's simply a product of modernity and postmodern and colonialism, or is it something that has persisted throughout the history of bhakti? People have called it compartmentalization. You know what I'm talking about, that it's all very well to talk about, you take even the Tamil Shaiva and Vaishnava traditions, you have one token woman, one untouchable, so all those things. But then when it comes to practice, how is it so easy to move from that wonderful, unifying discourse to this othering? Is it simply a product of modernity in the Western sense?
No,
that
that
we
is
know?
not. No,
so
no,
I wondered what.
Not for a moment should I be read as saying that.
I didn't read you that way. I was just asking.
No, but thank you for enabling me to clarify.
Yeah,
this.
I thought you could
After
talk
all, the
more
problem
about
of conditioned knowledge is very old.
Mm-hmm.
It would not be part of our philosophical traditions if the capacity to other was not always already present.
Absolutely.
Right? Mm-hmm. If the capacity to separate, if the capacity to discriminate, why do we talk of discriminating wisdom? Right? If these tendencies in human consciousness weren't already present, the Buddha would not have needed to have the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path.
Or
so
the
this
12
is very
steps.
old. It is assuming a particular form today, which we may name modern, in a kind of periodizing way, and in an epistemological way because of the way the othering is happening.
I see.
Okay? In that post-enlightenment sense.
Yes.
So nor do I wish to say that those who do not question their own disposition, their bhakti disposition, are without prejudice. I'm not saying they are innocent. I'm not saying that this is only an urban problem and somehow in rural India. All I'm saying is that in rural India, people are not unreflective. People are not shy about their inclination toward, or their disposition toward bhakti. I think we may be more shy.
Right, but then the further question then is, if we are confronting this entire problem as one that, bridges the urban-rural divide, Hindutva and all these things, then how do people then get beyond the othering? I think, I'm not asking you to provide a solution, but just the mapping, the cognitive mapping, what might enable people to get over the othering in some practical way? That's what I was thinking.
I think music and poetry, I think
Wonderful.
the energy of this music drops
I love
people
that.
into the depth of the philosophical promise,
Yes.
invitation, and
Yes.
truth.
Perfect.
I honestly think that even though my work is so cognitive, because that's my training, I honestly feel this is a time for art, music, poetry, philosophy, theater.
As Shabnam so beautifully illustrated this morning.
Performance, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I was just fascinated by your response to Danish's question, and I wanted to ask, is it safe to assume that in your view of spirituality, a triadic view of the universe is like the beginning of a way out of the prison of binary opposition between self and other? Is that I found that suddenly stimulating. And, I've been revising my Kabir the last few days, and he's fascinated with numbers too. And so 3 instead of 2, a third entity. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, self, other connectivity, self, other divinity. I see 2 triangles, upright this way, okay? Self, other connectivity, self, other divinity. And I feel like the flow that enables re-triangulates my relationship with everything and offers me. And I think it's not an accident that the triangle is so important in our tradition, And I'm only saying our tradition, not because I'm privileging it, because it's the one I know more than others. There'll be others who will tell me whether the triangle is important in other traditions. I'm saying our tradition not out of any sectarian loyalty, but out of my own ignorance, right? But I find that movement of self-other connectivity, because what is it that we have broken when we feel a sense of separation? What is it that has happened when we do not feel our intimacy, which always already exists, simply because of the nature of creation itself, right? It is connectivity. Othering is only possible when that thread has been snipped, if you will. So I find that triad very helpful. I also have found in my own journey, when I come to a moment of fear, could be a cognitive fear, epistemological fear, fear for life, fear for the possible survival of one's own identity at a certain moment in the spiritual journey, what allows me to take a deep breath and take the next step is this triad. Is feeling that I can be held in that one point until I am ready to confront whatever misperception it is that's holding me in a state of subjection, and from which I would do well to be freed. Does that make sense?
Lata, this is more like a comment, but I want your response to a comment about the relationship between sacred and the social. I think it is reasonable to say that there has been a fragmentation the way we have been taught, or the way we have fashioned our pedagogical system, where the social is either taken out, either the sacred is taken out of the social, or the sacred is reduced to the social. I'll just give one example. For example, sometimes I reviewed Sumit Sarkar's work, for example, on Ramakrishna. What it did is basically reducing the sacred to social. That's one. And the second, sacred is then expunged out of the social. And this fragmentation, according to me, is something which is the way we handle sacred as social theorists. We are not going beyond beyond this kind of equation. I don't know, this was provoked by your thinking about the relevance of the social.
I think
while
that's
thinking of, yeah.
That's excellent. I think there are these two moves. One is evacuation of the sacred from the social, and the other is a reduction of the sacred to the social. I think these two moves, I think you've identified them, you've named them really well. And my kind of sideways on response to that is to evoke and invoke an idea of time that is other than the historical. Because I think that there's nothing else that can account for the force of these practices and for their capacity to move even the most secular hearts. This is the poetry that is read at demonstrations. It arrives in slogans. It's on placards. It's not going away. It's really part of the common fund. It's part of the earth and the DNA, and it has persisted. And there's something about that energy, that something about our analytical frameworks either denies or fails to acknowledge or does not build on. I think it's an incredible resource for us, cultural resource, philosophical resource, epistemological resource, and we don't draw on it enough. Or we draw on it very instrumentally, and when we draw on it instrumentally, it loses its power, because it's not a form of instrumental knowledge. It's really an invitation. It's an invitation to death, a death that is a precursor to rebirth. And if you think about politics, what is politics? Politics is really imagining the future in the present and transforming the present to enable a future to be born, and to incubate that future in the practices that we undertake as part of our movements. So in that sense, it's very akin to the spiritual journey. Even though many political activists will find this a rather startling suggestion, actually, the rhythms are quite similar.
One observation and one question. One, I really appreciated your point about the moderate or the very open ground that continues to exist as human tendency today, particularly in India, is to get drawn to the binaries. But actually the ground is just as alive with this middle space. So I really appreciate that point, and I think this festival is a wonderful, Arundhathi, is a wonderful celebration of that, so thank you for that. My second observation is a question. One of the things that happens in life-changing, at that point, trauma, incident, whatever it is that we want to call it, is there is a certain friction of repair that begins sort of in our own minds, hearts, that you're confronting past, present, you're confronting what just happened, you're in sort of several centuries all at once. And in that, when I read fiction, it sort of covers a broad swathe of drama around incidents, around stories. I find such a distinct difference between that and spiritual literature, where so often in spiritual literature, these moments are, I'm very young at just being exposed to Buddhist traditions, so I'm not speaking of spiritual literature on sort of in a wide kind of way. There is this sense of, we are waiting for you. We are waiting for this to happen, or this is a possibility, or it's an ever-present something. So I think my question to you is that, from 1993 to now, are there any books or are there any sort of spiritual literature that you also like to share with us, that we could also go back to and inquire some more on the many possibilities that open up in the way spiritual literature looks at moments which seem to shift something in us very deeply? Which the trigger of which could be anything in the phenomenal world.
Gosh, I'm just going to shamelessly mention my books, okay? Partly because, no, I'm not, partly because it's hard for me to read, believe it or not. One of the problems of my injury is that reading has been quite difficult. So a lot of what I have learned, frankly, has come from direct experience or the teaching that I've received in meditation. That is the honest truth. And so I'm not very well read. And also, some of what you're asking, I think, the question within your question, I think you might find in this material. Two things I would point to. One is I wrote a kind of non-narrative memoir. It's non-narrative because I only had 10 minutes of concentration, and so I just used those 10 minutes to say whatever I needed to into a cassette, and it was then transcribed and so forth. So I brought a few copies of that, and that's out there. It's called Interleaves. And there's also another collection called the Tantra Chronicles. It's not out there. It's self-published, but it's downloadable from my website. Those are teachings that my partner and I received in meditation from a variety of spiritual teachers, Devi in the Hindu tradition, Shiva in the Hindu tradition, Jesus in the Christian tradition, Mary, and then Moon, which will now make me certifiably mad, the moon in the sky, who turns out to be an absolutely brilliant philosopher. So these were teachings that...
I'm so sorry, Lata, continue. I just wanted to say, don't forget you're in the company of poets.
Poets are also mad,
We are
certifiably mad.
we
Yes.
are lovers of the
Yes.
moon.
The lovers of the moon, exactly. So I would recommend those two things, but I know there's a lot of very rich literature out there, and I think we are hungry for stories of transformation. And I think I was listening to Shabnam this morning, and I think that she told us a journey of her own transforming consciousness through Kabir and through the other songs that she sang. And we went on a pilgrimage on one of her yatras, musical yatras with her. You know, so I think these are the forms perhaps that we should cultivate for sharing and for caring. And maybe these are forms of art practices that we might consciously cultivate as collective forms of being with uncertainty and thinking through possibility. And you know, I think primary to that is to open, as we have in this conference, to the idea of tradition as potentiality. We tend to think of tradition only as constraint, that which we must resist, that which must be stopped in its tracks before the Rath Yatra wheels flatten us out, right? There is this other way of, other critical inquiry, other way of engaging tradition, which we see here, of its radical potentiality and its exploration as part of our inheritance and as part of our own engagement with that which has been bequeathed to us.
And what better... Oh, okay. Yes, Sachi, please. That seemed like such a marvelous note to end on, but Sachi will have the last question.
It's not a question, it's a response to the binary that many of us in the hard-boiled academia, westernized secular academia, are aware of, have been conscious of, and we have been put on the defensive. And one of the ways by which, for example, this binary, which is a result of the Western epistemology, has come to India through the secular academia, which is suspicious of faith and also the sacred. If they mention sacred and the faith, it's in passing. One of the ways by which I have tried to overcome this, because I have been a believer on the removal of this kind of a divide which is artificial between the sacred and the profane. Of course, in the poetry sessions and elsewhere, we do acknowledge, but not in the hard-boiled academia. And also simultaneously, it is also equated with religionism, for example, and sectarianism. That is another kind of blurring which has to be avoided. One of the ways by which I have found an answer is through books of people like Leela Gandhi, Effective Communities and the Politics of Friendship. The way she is really critiquing the Kantian reason and showing other possibilities than the one which the West has really given us. I think those, and in my recent book, Cosmopolitan Modernity in Early 20th Century India, which I am mentioning shamelessly, because there are very few books of this kind, which is published by Routledge and done very well, and the second edition is there. I think it's those directions that we have to go and disprove this kind of a myth and falsity which is being circulating in the Western or the so-called secular academia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Lata, for this very special session. We are going to continue sampling Bhakti in various modes tomorrow, but today is not over yet. We are moving on to a performance, a music performance by the wonderful Kalapini Komkali, daughter of the legendary Kumar Gandharv. So the taste of Nirgun Bhakti that we started with has reappeared. It reappears as a motif, I think, in the course of this entire day. Tomorrow we move in subtler ways to Sagun Bhakti as well. But we move on now to a wonderful performance of music by Kalapini Komkali entitled Singing Emptiness, an evocative title in itself. We'll take a short break of about 15 minutes while the stage is set up, but I'd invite you to come back in 15 minutes because Ashok Vajpayee will say a few words contextualizing this music. He's been a close confrère of Pandit Kumar Gandharv himself. So we will have an entry point into the music as well from another perspective. We look forward to seeing you in 15 minutes. Thank you.